The Ukrainian Defense Forces are systematically disabling infrastructure in Russia's oil industry through deep strikes. What impact should we expect and when? We are discussing this with Maksym Bilyavskyi, an analyst at the Razumkov Center. This is a media center project to the point. Maksym, since the beginning of the year, we have observed a clear trend. Our defense forces have been striking Russia's oil refining sector with increasing frequency. These strikes appear to have a cumulative effect. Where could this lead? Since the beginning of the year, at least 70 such incidents have been recorded in open sources. More than 45% of these occurred at oil refineries, facilities where crude oil is processed into motor fuels. And not only motor fuels. For instance, gas that fuels bombers launching missiles at our civilian targets. The results of these strikes has been noticeable reducing the enemy's ability to supply its military infrastructure, facilities, and equipment with fuel. Second, over a quarter of the incidents targeted storage facilities for oil and petroleum products. This is essentially Russia's strategic reserve. Their storage capacity is not particularly large compared to more developed infrastructure in other countries, making it a critical vulnerability. Second, over a quarter of these incidents targeted storage facilities for oil and petroleum products. This is essentially Russia's strategic reserve. Their storage capacity is not particularly large compared to more developed infrastructures in other countries, making it a critical vulnerability. Around 10% of incidents struck transport infrastructure, such as oil pumping stations. Without them, crude oil cannot be moved from wellheads to processing plants. Overall, if we look at the disrupted capacity of Russia's oil sector in just 8 months, my conservative estimate is about 437 million tons. To put this in perspective, that's comparable to the entire commercial oil reserves of the United States. To put this in perspective, that's comparable to the entire commercial oil reserves of the United States. These are enormous volumes. And if we compare the scale with the last year, the disrupted capacity in 2025 far exceeded that of 2024. This is very significant development. I also want to highlight hostile propaganda, especially in January 2025. When such incidents peaked, Russian media tried to push the narrative that global oil prices would skyrocket. In fact, the opposite happened. Over the past 8 months, prices have declined to about $66 per barrel of WTI. What does this indicate? This shows the strike had no meaningful impact on global oil markets. The world did not feel the discomfort that Russian propagandists predicted. At the same time, what happened in the terms of foreign currency revenue? Actual exports of oil and petroleum products fell by 9.8%. Looking specifically at monthly currency inflows, the change is roughly as follows. Previously, there was about $15 billion per month in revenue from the export of bloody oil, the black hydrocarbons. By August, for example, it had dropped to less than $12 billion. So, we can clearly see a decrease in revenue of roughly $3 billion. These are quite significant, tangible financial resources. Looking at it on a monthly basis, including secondary effects, such as raising domestic fuel prices in the aggressor state, we see that the overall macroeconomic impact of these incidents amount to around $74 billion, or a 4.1% reduction in GDP. This is substantial and noticeable result. Let's look at this more closely. You say the Russian army should face shortages of fuel. Do we know how much petroleum products the Russian army consumes? To understand how significant this shortage might be and when it could occur. I can say that the domestic market in Russia is about 200 million tons annually. While there is no price breakdowns in open sources, many refineries are located near military airfields and garrisons. This suggests, at least theoretically, that up to 40% of that, around 80 million tons, is consumed by the Russian military. 40%, yes, 40%, that's about 80 million tons. Let's put it this way. When will this cumulative effect be felt? Will it influence the course of hostilities? Could it possibly influence them? It already is. We moved from a tactical impact, occasional fuel shortages, to a strategic one. How can we measure this? Where are the answers to these questions? By the distance of the targets from Ukraine's border. In early 2025, about 10% of the strikes were on facilities more than 1,000 kilometers from Ukrainian border, somewhere over 1,800 kilometers away. This shows Ukraine can hit deep into Russia's infrastructure, and that has strategic implications. A clear example is the oil pipeline facility that supplies aviation kerosene for bombers based at Engels airfield. This shows Ukraine can hit deep into Russia's infrastructure, and that has strategic implications. A clear example is oil pipeline facility that supplied aviation kerosene for bombers based at Engels airfield. To clarify, how far from Ukraine are most of Russia's refineries located? About 80% are within 2,000 kilometers, mostly to the Urals. All of them are within reach. Everyone knows it. Is Russia trying to relocate production further inland? That's not feasible. Oil refining is an extremely complex, immobile industry and vast in scale. Can Russia buy replacement parts abroad? China is helping, and that's a problem. But Russia's own engineering sector is also under strain. Production lines have limits. Too much demands overheats capacity. Even machine-building plants can only produce a few critical parts each year. So when several plants need replacement simultaneously, bottlenecks occur. The system cannot keep up. And we need to understand this as well. Against the backdrop of such intensity and consistency, the failure of certain critical components and parts of oil and gas equipment also affects, and, if you will, overheats mechanical engineer capacities. So a machinery plant might produce 2 or 3 parts per year. Accordingly, if 3 of these parts fail at different plants, it will take even longer to exactly right. And likewise, they are a queue. We also need to remember that the capacity of designers, engineers, and the hands that brings all this to life are limited. The intensity we are seeing in 2025 also affects the capacity and speed. It seems the Russian authorities will do everything to prioritize the army's fuel supply, even at the expense of the domestic market. Gasoline prices in Russia are rising. How long has this trend lasted? And how high could they go? Its price has already increased by at least 17%. That's excluding inflation, if we are roughly adjust retail prices, for example, for gasoline back in January. Right now, first and foremost, public sentiment matters, because rising fuel costs affect the final price of any service or product. At a minimum, for example, about 15% of the cost of bread comes from petroleum products. Russia sells $12 billion worth of oil and petroleum products to the world. What share of the global oil market is that? About 5%. I'm trying to understand why, even though Russia is selling less oil, global oil prices are falling. It's quite simple. The scale of the sanctions imposed on consumers, insurance companies, and the shadow fleet transporting these black hydrocarbons definitely supports the downward trend. I believe this effect exists. That's the first point. Second, there is the factor of maximum utilization and refining of this oil in countries like China and India, converting these resources into petroleum products. Second, there is the factor of maximum utilization and refining of this oil in countries like China and India, converting these resources into petroleum products. Given the low level of resale of Russian oil, or if you like, the small number of contracts or consumers for Russian oil, there is essentially no impact on global pricing. Let's summarize. So, our strikes on Russian refineries and storage facilities for oil and petroleum products, what do they lead to? They lead to reduction in GDP, for example, by about 4%. That's the main result. That's first. Second, they reduce the enemy's military capacity. Third, they influence public sentiment through price changes and loss of wealth. How much would global oil prices need to fall for Russia to feel this catastrophically? That's a very good question. Thank you for it. We need to understand the concept of the cost of producing Russian oil. The weighted average cost is roughly $40 per barrel. Current prices are $66 with a discount applied. I believe that the ceiling for Russia's oil prices will need to be cut by at least half, to around $30 per barrel. Only then could we see a significant reduction in export, if not a complete halt. Do you think the world has the capacity and political will to achieve this? I believe it does, but we need to act much faster. Am I correct in understanding that profits from the oil and gas industry are Russia's main revenue source, and without them its guard post television towers would be inoperative? Without financial support, propaganda is powerless, and the totalitarianism that unfortunately thrives will also fade into oblivion. We discussed the effect of striking Russia's oil infrastructure with analyst Maksym Bilyavskyi from the Razumkov Center. This is a media center project to the point. Take care of yourself.